Good afternoon, live and online, for today's meeting of the Center for Global Justice. I will go right to the introduction. We will take questions later from both audiences. My name is Bob Datz. I'm a member of the program committee in the center, and I'm really happy to introduce Jeff Halper and this program. I wish I was on the Columbia campus right now, but this is the next best thing. So we have evidence that you don't require a genocidal war to begin an ethnic cleansing. That's been going on for a long time. And Jeff Halper, our presenter for today's Center for Global Justice program, who is the co-founder and leader of Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, has been dealing with much, much more than that, both before and since the war began. For years, Jeff argued forcefully that the two-state solution, so-called, that the U.S. clings to is in shambles. The ICAHD website notes that more than 173,000 Palestinian homes had been demolished in Israel and in the occupied territory since 1947. That last year alone, their analysis revealed that over almost 1,400 structures were demolished, 1,537 people displaced in the West Bank, and another 66,136 people directly affected. And in the year before, 2,845 structures were demolished in the Negev, I'm mispronouncing that badly, including 771 homes. Now, this is just homes. It doesn't even touch the agricultural land, the theft of water, and the daily experience of occupation.
Don't forget, Bob, don't forget the 300,000 homes in Gaza that have been demolished in the last 6 months. 70% of Gaza's housing. So add that to the list.
Right. This is just pre-war. I mean, not just pre-war, but it's decades. And so I would like to introduce a bit about Jeff. He's going to assess options remaining for Palestine and Israel in a hopefully soon post-war context that has historical roots that are getting more complex by the day. He's made his home in Israel since 1973. It is also a co-founder of the One Democratic State campaign. Jeff is from Hibbing, Minnesota, along with Bob Dylan and former Boston Celtics star Kevin McHale, and received his BA from Macalester College and a doctorate in anthropology from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He was an adjunct lecturer in anthropology at University of Haifa and Ben-Gurion University, with the majority of his academic career spent at Friends World College as director of its Middle East Center in Jerusalem. In 1991, became director of the International Academic Operations and an associate professor. Jeff is the author of several books, including Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State in 2021, War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians, and the Global Pacification, 2015, Obstacles to Peace, a reframing of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that was published in 2009, and An Israeli and Palestine Resisting Dispossession, Redeeming Israel, 2008, all published by Pluto Press. His road to activism began with the civil rights movement and the anti-war movements in the U.S., where he logged a number of righteous arrests. Dr. Halper was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by the American Friends Service Committee for his work, quoting, to liberate both the Palestinian and Israeli people from the yoke of structural violence, and to build equality between their people by recognizing and celebrating their common humanity. So with that, I will let Jeff continue. Welcome.
Thank you much, Bob. for an introduction. I'd like to listen to that guy. Sounds interesting. And thank you all for joining. And thanks for inviting me. It certainly is a topic that's in the headlines these days. As Bob mentioned, from Columbia University, now the protests are spreading to European universities as well. A lot of things are coming down the pipeline. The International Criminal Court is poised, maybe, it's not clear yet, to issue warrants of arrest for Netanyahu and the defense minister Gallant and the chief of staff Herzl Levy. So that would be a kind of a game changer in some ways, I think. What's happening in Gaza, and actually, I think 5 or 6 European countries are poised to recognize Palestine as a state, which is a mixed blessing. But certainly Palestine has shown us that it's not simply a local issue, that the Palestinian issue is destabilizing to the Middle East in general, which is already a pretty destabilized, militarized, oppressive, autocratic place, but certainly globally. And the fact, and we'll talk about this in a bit, the fact that that Biden is linking the release to the hostages to normalization between Israel and the Arab world. This is the sweetener to get Netanyahu to back down from invading Rafah, the southern part of Gaza, and agreeing to releasing the hostages. The normalization with Saudi Arabia, and then the rest of, with the Abraham Accords, the rest of the pro-Western Arab world already normalized with Israel. In a sense, that ends everything. That's the idea. You quietize the Palestinian population, but the point I'm trying to make is that you see in what seems to be a very specific localized issue, the hostage deal is linked to this whole big issue of geopolitics and normalization. So there's a direct link between this the violence on the ground, the oppression on the ground, and so on, and greater geopolitical realities and dynamics that reach into Mexico as well. Israel is one of the major arms supplier to Mexico, and more important, Israel is probably the major arms exporter to the Mexican police and security services. So Mexico is very deeply involved in Israeli militarism. So what I'd like to do is just go back and try to explain, the nature of this kind of a situation. Bob, can your guy let me share the screen? Enable me to show a couple slides?
Yes. One moment, please.
Assuming we're all technically capable of doing that. Because I sometimes, visuals kind of help more than just, okay, great. So let me just, we have to go back. Let me just back up for a minute and explain why what the nature of this situation is and how it affects any kind of an outcome, why the two-state solution is impossible. Okay, so where I want to start here is here. You can all see this slide, right?
Yes.
We're misdiagnosing the whole political situation here. And diagnosis is important. If you go to the hospital, the diagnosis determines what treatment you're going to get. You get the wrong diagnosis and you get the wrong treatment, and it doesn't really aid in getting well. And that's what's happened in Israel, Palestine all these years. It's been misdiagnosed as a conflict. We talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, the Israeli-Arab conflict, but it's not a conflict. And we have to stop using that terminology if we're going to be advocates or if we want to understand what's happening, and say there is no conflict. A conflict is between two or more sides, right? Well, the minute you talk about Israel as a side, you're already legitimizing what I'm going to argue is a settler colonial entity. You're legitimizing Israel as a side that I don't think should be legitimized. In addition, how do you get into a conflict? The conflict is you get into a fight about something. Well, in settler colonialism, which is what Zionism is, and I'll explain it in detail in a minute, there is no dispute. The Palestinians never had a dispute with Jews. Certainly not the Jews that were living in Palestine or the wider, but with the Jewish people in Ukraine and Russia and Poland. I mean, there was never a dispute. It isn't like we always now, of course, we've weaponized anti-Semitism. So now we've made out the Palestinians to be Nazis and to be anti-Semites, and every time you support Palestinians, you hear this about the protests in the U.S. now all the time on CNN. It's all anti-Semitic. Any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, which is a redefinition of anti-Semitism that Israel is trying to get through parliaments in the world, universities to adopt this, as states in the United States to adopt this. You see, and so this whole idea of a conflict, feeds into all of that, because what it does is it creates a false symmetry, as if there's a conflict between two sides. But I'm going to explain in a minute that settler colonialism is unilateral. There aren't two sides. And the third problem with conflict is that it it doesn't lead you anywhere, because conflict resolution does not fit as a solution for a colonial situation. You have to decolonize. What I'm trying to say, because I'm going to get into this right now, is that rather than talking about a conflict, we have to look at this and talk about it and use the language of an anti-colonial struggle against Zionist settler colonialism. That's what we're talking about, and not a conflict between two legitimate sides that got into a fight about something and now they have to compromise, and somehow the Palestinians have to learn how to live with, living under apartheid. I mean, so this paradigm shift is really important. Now, let me just go over really quickly, just take me a minute, what I mean by settler colonialism, because it's an academic term. It's become kind of used now, but it's not completely understood. It's a complex concept, and it's often used as kind of an accusation to delegitimize Israel, and then you get on to other things, but it means something. And without understanding the nature of Zionism, you see, and what its agenda is, and how it's structured, and how it's worked, and what its aims are, what its purpose is, you can't possibly understand the political situation today, what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, and where Israel is going with all of this, which brings us right into the whole issue of two states and one state. So let's just look over this. What is settler colonialism for a minute, okay? First of all, settler, and of course, Israel's not the only country that's settler colonial. Mexico was settler colonial. A lot of Latin America, the United States, Canada, of course, are all settler colonial countries. Although in those places, the indigenous have been so genocided out, and are so small and marginal and powerless populations that they don't have the national aspirations and the demographic size that the Palestinians do. The settler colonialism in Israel can be, I think, the closest match, or the closest thing to compare it to, is settler colonialism in South Africa, where the Black African population living under apartheid, settler colonial apartheid, was strong enough demographically and in terms of its political aspirations to assert its national rights. So there's a difference between settler colonialism, like in the United States or Mexico, where there is no challenge to the settler colonial country. I mean, the indigenous Americans are not going to overthrow the states that rule over them. So it's so what they're trying to do, the indigenous in North America and Latin America, is to try to create some kind of a cultural space, where we can, our culture can be respected. We can have our own schools, maybe get some of our lands back, have some control of our resources, those kinds of issues. That's what we call the fourth world indigenous struggles. The Palestinians are an indigenous population that have also been colonized. The difference being, however, that they're not simply a small, powerless, marginal community. They're the majority population until today in historic Palestine, with another 6 or so million refugees waiting to come back outside, and they have national aspirations. So that's where this idea of conflict comes in, because I mean, there is a certain symmetry in the fact that while Israel is militarily and politically so much stronger than the Palestinians, it hasn't been able to nail down its pacification of the Palestinians. It hasn't been able to get on with conquering Palestine, replacing the Palestinians, and just creating the country of Israel. The struggle continues, as we can see today, and the Palestinians, for everything else, have held their own to a certain degree, with the possibility of actually winning in terms of pushing back settler colonialism. So from that point of view, it's the Palestinians are in a very different situation than the indigenous in many other places. All right, in settler colonialism, quickly, first of all, the settler movement, it's when a foreign population comes to a country with the intent of taking it over, right? It's not like the British in India, classical colonialism, where they come conquer a country like India, but the purpose isn't to settle it. The purpose isn't to make India British or to annex India to Britain. The purpose is simply extraction, to extract resources, to extract cheap labor, to contribute to the British Empire. In Palestine, like in the United States, and actually like in Latin America, the settlers came from Europe with the intent of taking over those societies, of getting rid of the indigenous population through genocide or marginalization, displacement, and replacing their societies with societies that resemble the European societies that are the colonists. Now, you have to invent a narrative that entitles you to doing that, because even as cynical as settler colonialism can be in terms of its actual just goals of conquest and extraction and genocide, you still kind of have to explain to yourself and to others why you're doing this and why you're justified in doing this, in invading another country and taking it over. I mean, for the Spanish and the Portuguese in Latin America, the Catholic Church and later on the Enlightenment gave all kinds of legal and theological excuses, the doctrine of discovery in the Catholic Church, that just, I think this last year, the Pope finally renounced. The doctrine of discovery, saying that these aren't real human beings, and mainly because they don't have property. So they don't have laws. They're savages, and therefore and therefore it's perfectly justified for a civilized country with laws to not impose them, to extend them into a a savage place in order to either civilize the savages or get rid of. In other words, there was a lot of theological, and then in the Enlightenment, Hume and Locke and all these great figures, also justified colonialism. So that's that. In the United States, you had manifest destiny, of course. The idea that, God, this is a divinely blessed, the continent of North America belongs to us. In South Africa, it was, again, religion. God gave, the Dutch Reformed Church said God gave South Africa to the white man. In Israel, you've got a ready-made, in Zionism, a ready-made narrative. You've got the Bible. I mean, God gave us the land. I mean, you can't get much more of an entitled deed to a country than that. But the French, of course, aren't religious. And so their narrative had to do, again, with civilizing. The civilizing mission, they called it, towards the natives of Indochina or West Africa or Algeria or whatever. The point is that every settler movement invents a narrative that entitles it to replace the indigenous population. And one of the big problems that the Palestinians are facing is that the Israeli narrative or the Jewish narrative or the Zionist narrative makes sense to people. First of all, that God gave this land to the Jews. So you got all the evangelicals in the world that believe in that, plus others. The idea that somehow, of course, Israel belongs to Jews, that association. And then you throw in the Holocaust, you see, and Jews, being persecuted and, needing a country of their own, and with a racial subtext. Jews are white, and they're like us. So that, settlers, we talk about settlers, well, you had, John Wayne and the Cowboys were settlers in the West. Little House on the Prairie, Paul was a settler. So that even the language, it makes sense to Americans and beyond. So that Zionism has a very strong narrative. It's a fake, made-up narrative, but it's strong and it makes sense and it's clear and it's compelling, whereas the Palestinians don't have a narrative. And that's true all over. The native populations that are being colonized, they don't have a narrative. I mean, they don't have to explain themselves. They don't have to justify why they're living there. Why invent a narrative to justify your existence and your entitlement to land that you've lived in forever? That's your native land. See, and there you get an asymmetry, because then when you do get these parties in conflict, so-called, the settlers have this tremendous advantage of having a narrative that supports their settler project, and the indigenous don't. And that's why the Palestinians, it's very easy to cast the Palestinians as terrorists and as interlopers and, and as bad people, and the settler colonial movement then presenting itself as this justified, peaceful movement of people that simply want to come home to their own land, and here you've got these bad terrorists attacking them for no reason. So, the narrative makes a lot, is very important in this. Now, the settlers, that are all supported by some metropole, the Zionists by the Jewish communities, especially in Western Europe, invade the country they want to take over in order to make it their own. Now, the invasion doesn't have to be like Normandy. It can be, the Pilgrims, in a sense, invaded North America, although it took time and it was gradual. And it took quite a while. It took maybe 10 years for the Palestinians from the 1880s, 1890s into the 20th century to begin to understand that they were being invaded. Only towards the turn of the century do you begin to have in Palestinian newspapers the idea that the Zionists want to take over our country. That begins to appear in 1905 or something like that. So the invasion can be very invidious and take time. So settler colonialism is unilateral, as I said before. It's not a conflict between two sides. The settlers invade unilaterally. It has nothing to do, the Zionism had nothing to do with Arabs or Palestinians or Palestine. It was a self-contained narrative that this is Israel, it's our country, we're coming home, and we came home. That in settler colonial language is an invasion. But the point is, it's unilateral. There was never a conflict with Palestinians. There was never a war. It wasn't like the Palestinians attacked Jews and now Israel's there was nothing. It was completely unilateral, and the Palestinians were and are, this is an important point, irrelevant to the whole situation. Israel does not think about Palestinian rights. Until today, Israel has never, ever recognized the very existence of the Palestinian people, let alone their national rights. So that the natives are simply people to be pushed aside. They have no claim. And from Israel's point of view, there's no occupation. Because Israel defines occupation in contrast to international law. Nevertheless, Israel defines occupation as when one sovereign country conquers the territory of another sovereign country. Well, there was never a sovereign before 1967, when Israel conquered the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. Before that, it was Jordan, which was itself an occupying power. Before that, it was the British Mandate, doesn't exist. Before that, it was the Ottoman Empire, that doesn't exist. So Israel said there's no other claimant besides us. Well, what about the Palestinians? The millions of Palestinians that live in Palestine, they don't count because they were never a state. And so again, Israel's able to use the idea that it's a state and the whole issue of sovereignty to completely nullify any Palestinian claims, because there's simply a population that was living there that have no legal claim to the land. So the settlers then unilaterally remake the country in their own image. The point of Zionism is to turn Palestine into Israel, to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country. That's the point that's the whole purpose of it. So to go from what I'm just saying to a two-state solution is ridiculous. I mean, it just doesn't fit the conception and the purpose and the aims of a settler colonial movement like Zionism. Settler colonialism has genocide built into it. And now that word has come out with Gaza, but in fact, we've been going through an incremental genocide since 1947, 48, the Nakba. I mean, the Palestinians, were displaced, dispossessed, killed, driven out of the country, their lands taken, in a sense, their culture destroyed in part or in whole, which is a definition of genocide, way before Gaza. I mean, we're going back, 75, 76 years. And it has to be genocidal, because you can't take over a country and make it your own country and take the land without getting rid of the indigenous population. It has to be genocidal. There's no other way you can clear the land, erase the presence of the indigenous population in order to make it your own country. So there's a combination of physical genocide that happened more in Mexico than it had. That's not so much the form of genocide here, but certainly cultural genocide. But a violent cultural genocide, as you can see in Gaza. And in fact, settler colonialism is inherently violent because it's a process of dispossession, and therefore it must be resisted by the local population. It's not, okay, now I'm gonna come back to how that is reframed and so on. And so in order to justify its violence, its genocide, its repression, its robbing of lands and so on of the native population, settler colonialism criminalizes resistance. You see, so that's where the whole idea of terrorism comes in. See, we never use the word. That's why I'm saying if we begin to adopt a colonial discourse, then we start to use terms like resistance for what Palestinians are doing, including Hamas, rather than terrorism. When we talk about terrorism, we're just playing in to the Israeli narrative that, yes, these are a bunch of criminals, that are just attacking us. And of course, part of this whole thing is not only criminalizing native resistance, but states, you never hear about state terrorism, even though all right, 850 innocent people or so were killed by Hamas on October 7th, and that was an act of terror. Doesn't mean they're terrorists. Again, you're not criminalizing an entire people or a movement, but there are acts of terror like happened on October 7th. But in reaction, Israel's killed up to more than 40,000, Palestinians, 70% being women and children. But you see, only the Palestinians, only Hamas is being called a terrorist group, and not Israel as a state, because you really don't have a concept of state terrorism, because states have a right to have an army. As Biden would tell you, Israel has a right to defend itself. Non-state actors don't have those rights to defend themselves. They should be defended by international law. The Palestinians should be able to go to the UN and say, Israel, we're undergoing genocide, or the ICJ, and get protection. But international law doesn't really work. It's great, but there's no enforcement. And so states are able to get away with criminalizing the indigenous population's resistance, and at the same time whitewashing their own terrorism, which is much worse, by simply characterizing native deaths as collateral damage. All right. And therefore, and this is really important, because this again gets to this terrorist thing. Indigenous resistance cannot be equated with the violence, with the violence of the settlers' campaigns of colonization. And that's really important, because all the time, if we talk about a conflict, we're talking about both sides. Both sides have to stop the violence. How many times have you heard that? Well, that's the equation of resistance to settler colonialism. I mean, Israel can continue its settler colonial project without violence at this point. Settlement, taking land by legal means, the whole civil administration in the West Bank. It doesn't need the army to continue that. So that the minute you talk about both sides should end the violence, the settlers can say, fine, we end the violence. We're peaceful, but they're still violent. They, and therefore they're terrorists. You can see how the language allows that kind of manipulation. And because indigenous resistance can never end, because the indigenous population can never, ever accept its, its dispossession, including the more powerless groups like Native Americans in Mexico. Insecurity is built into the settler state. Certainly in a situation like South Africa or Algeria or Israel, where, again, the indigenous population is so large and ever present. And therefore, the indigenous remain under military repression and a racialized regime of control that I call the regime of dominance management. I won't get into all this, but you can see what we call the process of Judaization that results. This Judaization is the name I give. Well, not I give. It's a Zionist Israeli term. It's a term used officially by the Israeli government. We're Judaizing Jerusalem. We're Judaizing the Galilee. So the process of Judaization is very clear, It's very lineal. You can see how the country's being taken over. And of course, the flip side of Judaization is decolonization. The point is that in this unilateral way, the purpose of Zionism is to take over Palestine, all of Palestine, from the river to the sea, transform it into a Jewish state, dispossess the local population, and make it into Israel. That's the Judaization, de-Arabization process. And if that's the purpose, and that's the structure of it, and that's the process you see here in front of you of taking land and so on, the whole idea of two states becomes ridiculous. Because in two states, you've got to recognize that there's another nation of the country, that the settler colonists, the Jews can't, the Zionists can't recognize Palestinians as a people with legitimate rights, because that would contradict their own exclusive claim to the country, right? They're certainly not going to allow a Palestinian state to emerge in Judea and Samaria and East Jerusalem, which is the heart of the land of Israel. This is where all the biblical events take place. And given the built-in insecurity of a settler colonial campaign, they're never going to allow any Palestinian state that emerges to have to be genuinely sovereign, to be economically viable, to have control of its borders. That can never happen. And in fact, the only way out, unless the settlers can either wipe out the indigenous population, like happened in Argentina, or certainly wipe them out for the most part, but marginalize them, like in Mexico and in the United States. Unless you can do that, you're stuck in a situation like South Africa or Israel, Palestine. And that is, okay, we've conquered the country, we've dispossessed the Palestinians, we've taken their land, this is Israel, but we still have, 6 million Palestinians in the country that we can't just throw out. We can't kill them in the light of day, in the light of CNN camp. What do we do with them? And therefore, in this kind of a situation, the answer is the same as South Africa, apartheid. You take those people and you lock them into, I think it's blocked, the map kind of by the picture, but it doesn't matter. You lock them into little islands on, in our situation, on about 15% of historic Palestine. I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, and you can see by these red and also green dots, these are demolitions only since 2004. You can see, how demolitions are a part of the ethnic cleansing process. You can see very clearly the relation between this map of demolitions and the previous map that's kind of hidden of the Bantustan that Israeli apartheid is creating. And finally, just one more thing I want to say, the settler project triumphs then when it normalizes. The settlers set up a state, and it becomes a normalized state. The indigenous disappear. Their presence is pretty much erased from the country. All the name places are changed, and in our situation, Hebrewized. It wins international recognition. So here, just this week, Israel is a state, a member of the UN, and the Palestinians have been denied international recognition as a state. So that normalizes Israel. Of course, the violent colonial past is erased again. All right, and again, the resistance is criminalized and delegitimized as terrorism. And then the settler colonial project triumphs when it becomes normal. And Israel, until October 7th, was getting very close to that. It was on the cusp of signing the normalization with Saudi Arabia. The Palestinians were already marginalized. Nobody cared about them. And, you can argue about terrorism or not, But had the attack on October 7th not taken place, the Palestinians would have been erased as a political force. And I think that's where Biden and Israel are trying to get back to that. They're desperately trying to revive that normalization process. But to do that, they've got to quietize the Palestinian issue. All right, so how do we get out of this then? All right, well, what I want to argue, first of all, just not argue, but just I think you get it by now. The second map here, that's why the two-state solution isn't dead. The two-state solution never was. I mean, if the settler, it's a unilateral project of settlement, it's complete displacement. You don't recognize the existence and the national rights of the indigenous people, and you take their land. So the whole idea that somehow Israel's done that. In other words, we already have one state. We have to understand that. There already is one state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. There's only, the whole country is run by Israel. Whether it's the West Bank or the Palestinian Authority, which is collaborationist, there is one state today. And there's 750,000 settlers living in this gray area of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And more, and you can see in the third map, a whole network of highways that incorporate the West Bank into Israel. And Israel controls all the water, and of course it controls all the borders and the economy and so on. So the idea that Zionism has completed its task pretty much. It has taken over Palestine. It has settled Palestine. And in fact, we don't talk about occupation. I don't know if Biden has ever mentioned the word occupation, not to mention in Israel, we don't use that. So we talk today about Judea and Samaria. We don't talk about the West Bank. So that normalization process is very advanced. So the idea then that Zionism has gotten this far, and all of a sudden it's going to say, whoa, wait a minute. Okay, two-state solution. Now we're going to recognize the Palestinians as the people. We're going to pull our 750,000 settlers out of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. We're going to allow a viable Palestinian state to emerge. It's ridiculous. So not only, is it ridiculous, but it never was. It was never intended, and it was never possible, and including in Oslo. The two-state solution was not mentioned in the Oslo Accords at all. And every time Arafat said we're negotiating towards a two-state solution, Rabin would come in and say, no, we're not. We're negotiating. It's open-ended, and that's why it collapsed, because there was no point to the Oslo negotiations. There was no goal. There was no end game. But he would say, no, we can't agree to a two-state solution at the beginning of negotiations, because that would prejudice the negotiations. So it was all open-ended and in bad faith. So what I'm arguing then is the only way out, if you don't want to enter into apartheid, which we are. I mean, the UN has said that there already is an apartheid regime in Israel and the occupied territories. The only way out then is to transform Israel and its occupation into one democratic state that belongs to everyone. The first step in that is to decolonize. You've got to dismantle the structures of domination and control and dispossession that exist. I won't get into all of that, but you can see you've got to completely eliminate all the policies and structures and controls of the legal system and the political system, the land management system in which the whole country is Israeli state land, the economy, the population management, where there's all kinds of citizens and non-citizens and so on. And of course, the management of legitimacy, which has to do with PR and the Hasbara and the whole settler narrative. I'm not going to get into this right now, but I'll come back to that if I'm going to finish now. So I know it's getting late. It's getting late in my world, less in your world. but we have to have time for discussion, of course. So what's the idea of the one? So I'm part of a Palestinian-led group called the One Democratic State Campaign. And we have a 10-point program that it took us a couple of years to work out between Palestinians and Israelis. I think it's a very solid program. It isn't the program, but we're the first group that's taken this idea of one state that's been in the air for a long time. It was the PLO's project, one democratic state, when it started. So it's not something new. But we're the first organization that has really detailed what it would look like. Try to really think it through and say, okay, what would this look like? How would it work? And we've come up with 10 points. I'm not going to give you all 10. I'll give you maybe 4 or 5 really quickly. First of all, we're talking about one state, which is a single constitutional democracy. Like, you figure the United States. One country, one citizenship, right? One parliament, one set of laws. A democracy, a civil state. In a way, we have to invent a new state because it's not going to be Palestine and it's not going to be Israel and it's not going to be controlled by either national group. But it has to be a state that belongs to everyone with public schools and public institutions and a constitution and laws and political institutions and so on. And therefore, we really have to invent a new state, in my view, and we don't have a name for that state yet. But that's the idea. That includes then, as I just, built into that are individual rights. There's no discrimination, a freedom of movement, everybody lives where they want to, travel freely, everyone works together, studies together, and so on. Thirdly, of course, the refugees return or have the choice to return. That's crucial. I mean, you can't have any resolution of this without the right of the refugees to return. But not only that, we also talk about their reintegration into society. We're talking about a traumatized, often undereducated, underskilled population, especially the refugees coming from the camps in the Arab world. And therefore, we have to not only allow them to come home as citizens, but reintegrate them into society. Now, there's, all right, let me just jump to one more, just one thing, and then I want to get into the complication for just a minute. And that is the good idea here, or the hopeful part of this is that this fosters a new civil society. We all become, let's say the name of the state is Zatar, all right? And we all become Zatarians. Zatar is the famous spice, Palestinian spice, just to say, or we pick some neutral term. Zatar might sound too Palestinian. Orangeville is a bit too Israeli, but we'll find it. But let's just call it Zatar, and we're all Zatarians. That's the name of the country. So the idea then is that we're free of Israeli and Palestinian identities. In other words, I have a choice. If I'm religious, or I'm traditional, or I really want to live within my culture, I can do that. But to the degree that this is an open society, and it'll be a prosperous society because the economy will be very good, and the Palestinians are a highly educated population with a very educated and rich diaspora that would support them as well. The young people, the good thing about young people is they just get on with their lives. And if the conditions are created where people are living together in a normal society and they have equal rights and they have a good economy and they're just getting on with their lives, that's what this idea allows. It's not a binational state. You're not locked into your identity is voluntary. You can be as Palestinian or as Israeli or Zionist or religious as you want to be. Fine, you know, you can do that. But you can also be as Zatarian as you want to be. Now, there's one, and I'm going to finish. I'm sorry. I hope this isn't too long, but you know, building a new country is a complicated thing, so it takes a couple minutes. There's one complication here, and that is in our concept, we recognize that this is not Kansas. We're not just a bunch of individuals. It's true, we have individual rights, we're all citizens, but there are two national groups in this country, Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, neither one of which recognize the other as a national group, but sociologically they're there. We won't get into all that stuff. So the question is, what do you do with national groups? Because nationalism is destructive. Nationalism, it's nice to have a national identity, but nationalism wants hegemony. It wants control. The Palestinians want this to be a Palestinian state for obvious reasons. The Zionists, the Jews wanted, the Israelis wanted to be an Israeli Jewish state. So what do you do? And you have a situation here, you can see, where both of the nationalisms begin to fight with each other. So you're liable to have a civil war if those nationalisms are allowed to have their way. But they're also at war with the civic state. They're at war with Zatar because they want to be the sovereign, not you know, a civil state that belongs to everyone. And the history of post-colonial states in the third world is not a happy history, partly because, you know, they break down into all these civil wars and fighting for hegemony. And then throw into that Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the whole pan-Islamic nationalism that's at war with everybody else. You see, so it's a very, so the point we're trying to make is there has to be a strong civil state. Zatar is really important, a strong civic state that we all belong to that is able to constrain and control the nationalisms. It means we have to acknowledge them. We have to transform political nationalism that wants to rule into a cultural nationalism that is able to express itself fully. So both national groups can have museums, they can have universities, they'll have their literature, they'll have their newspapers, their media, their schools, maybe, you know, they'll have all the ability to express themselves culturally as long as they do so within the framework of the civic state. And I'll end on this, then this is sort of what that one state would look like. See, you've got this, once Zatar is created, this new civil state, you know, not everybody's going to join in right away, you know, because people are still, you know, there'll be a process. But I think the young people will, the middle classes will more secular, moderate religious people will, and then other groups in society. You've got 500,000 ethnic Russians living in this country who aren't Jewish. You've got 40,000 asylum seekers from Africa living here in the second generation already. You do have people here that would move right away into this civil society. And the idea is that over time, it would begin to expand out as the economy works, as life is normalized, as people get to know each other. And this is sort of, and gradually this white space of civil society will get bigger. You still have the legitimacy, of course, of your national identities, but the whole idea of living within a civil state together makes a lot of sense, and it's good for everyone. It's a win-win for everyone. So that's the story, and let's talk about it if you still have, if anybody's left, and you still have the energy.
Oh, we still have people online and in the room. So I just wanted to throw a quick question in because I have to leave at a certain point, and that is the degree to which a one-state solution would have to be strongly imposed versus waiting
Right.
for the initiative to come out of the Holy Land.
Well, that's where you guys come in. Because what happened in South Africa, I mean, it was obvious that the whites in South Africa were not going to allow the dismantling of the apartheid system. Why would they? I mean, they were beneficiaries of that system. Israeli Jews are not going to allow the end of Zionism and this one state. We know that. So what did the ANC do? The ANC simply bypassed them. You know, Mandela didn't bother knocking on doors of white people explaining why apartheid was bad. They went to you and me all of us of a certain age were all involved in the anti-apartheid movement. They went to churches. They went to trade unions. They went to universities and intellectuals and activist groups and human rights groups and a whole anti-apartheid movement. And then they did BDS. When Ford Motor Company pulled out of South Africa, that was a sign that other corporations did not want to be soiled by being associated with apartheid, right? And then you had the sports boycott. In other words, you had a situation, and that wasn't the only story, but that was a big part of it, in which South Africa was gradually isolated, and finally the regime became unsustainable and collapsed. And the business people were actually more influential, in my view, than the ANC was in ending apartheid. It was just an unsustainable system. We can replicate that. If we have a good one-state program, like I presented, that's advocated by Palestinians, we can advocate the kids in Columbia University, all over the world. I mean, there's millions of people went out for Palestinians in the last couple months. So that strength is there. I think Palestine has reached the level of the anti-apartheid movement. The trouble is that there's no end game. With apartheid, we knew the end game was one person, one vote, and that's what we fought for. Here, the PA is talking about two states, Biden's talking about two states, Netanyahu's not talking about anything. People are talking about federations and this, and it's not clear. And so you abroad that support Palestinian rights don't have a political program to advocate for, and that's the weakness. So if we can insert that by getting a critical mass of Palestinians behind a political program of one state, then I think we can mobilize you, and I think we can also make the Israeli apartheid regime collapse. So it's not so much imposing it, but it has to be by force, but it has to be by simply making the one state more logical, more beneficial, a better alternative than trying to keep this apartheid regime that Israel's going to try to maintain by force. That's a short answer.
Shall we start in-house with questions? We can do that. Can
I make a comment about that? I'm on Zoom. Can I make a comment about that?
Of course.
Well, we were going to start with an in-house question. So if you make it quick, we can get to that, and
it's quick. It's
questions.
It's about a sentence and a half. That constraint that is necessary in order to build the pursuit of the justice is named communism, which we are taught from the cradle in the United States to hate and fear. What it is it's our owner's enemy. The people that own the earth, whatever, all of us, are frightened to death of the people becoming attracted to communism, which is happening anyway all over the world.
Okay, thank you. And obviously capital has a role to play in this whole thing. Any questions from the in-house audience before we swing it back out. I'll pass the mic.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, which I enjoyed. I do have a lot of questions and comments about it, and areas which I don't think from a historical point of view are totally accurate. For 60 years, I have been criticized by many people as either a self-hating Jew or Jewish anti-Semite or something like that, because I've had critique of Israel and its policies in many respects. But the overall, and to me, of course, there's the irony of the history with the Irgun in the 40s, having been labeled by the British as a terrorist organization, and in your explanation of, what is terrorism and who's labeled as terrorism was very interesting. But I'd like to go back to your one state, which I think is, the end game that you're looking for. Frankly, I have a hard time seeing it come to fruition because the Israeli Jewish population, I don't think, is in any way near being on board something like that. The power is way too much. The necessity for Palestinian labor to run the Israeli economy is something we didn't touch upon, but I think is also extremely important. And Israel, as you have mentioned, exports weapons, but also exports things like Pegasus and so forth, which are very important to many, many regimes around the world, not only so-called democratic ones, but ones that are very obviously not democratic or autocratic. So it's always easy to say what we're against and we want and what we're for in the liberation of peoples, but how we get there is going to be very difficult. And frankly, right now, and you mentioned it, with so many countries around the world not looking toward this kind of a one-state solution, which you have outlined, which makes a lot of sense in so many ways, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to achieve, unfortunately.
Well, let me just say, really quickly, that I think it's a new idea. In other words, even though it's, like I said, it's been in the air, I think that in this situation where everybody knows, it's like the Leonard Cohen song, everybody knows that there is no two-state solution. Everybody, it's pretty much exposed what Israel is. Settler colonialism has become a very common term to use. And in a way, just the logic of it all just points to one state. I said there already is one state, basically. The idea of a two-state solution also, in which you have to somehow dismantle settlements and send 750,000 Israelis home, is much more difficult to imagine than transforming one apartheid state that already exists into one democratic state. So there's a transformation, which is very much like South Africa, that transformed itself from an apartheid regime with a transition to the democratic regime. So I think once we articulate this, and once again, with the maps and the visuals and the program, and it comes out, and the point is that it's not against Israelis, it's not against Jews, but it's a win-win for everyone, and it's either that or apartheid. I think hopefully the logic of it and the justice of it and the practicality of the one state, once it's really laid out so people can really see and visualize what we're talking about, I think would make a lot of sense. And that's a strength. We're not there yet because no one's really detailed what the one state was. It's not a part of the conversation yet. Once it does become a part of the conversation, I think it just makes sense. It'll be very compelling, and it'll have some wind at its back. There'll be a lot of opposition, but I think for the masses of the peoples that support Palestinian rights, it will really make a lot of sense. And that's, I think, where it becomes realistic in a way that it isn't yet today.
Okay, another in-house question. We will deliver the mic.
Yes, thanks a lot. That was really informative. I would like to know what your opinion would be as to the role of the United States in some kind of a one-state transition, maybe in the way of South Africa or something. So what would be the United States' role? We've had a pretty big role in developments historically, and what would the U.S.'s role going forward be? Thanks.
Well, it's a double bind. The United States has a lot of clout, and certainly Israel depends completely on the United States. I mean, one reason why they're not invading Rafah is that so far the American government has vetoed it. And it supplies all 80%, 85% of Israeli weapons are American. So there is that. On the other hand, of course, the problem we have, I'm not going to get into another lecture, I promise. Problem we have is this, that governments work on a completely transactional basis. There are no values, despite what Biden talks about, a rules-based international order. There is no such thing. International law, human rights means nothing in terms of actual realpolitik. And it's all short-term deals, and there's no vision, there's no strategy, and that's the problem we're dealing with. In that kind of a situation, it's very hard to get a country like the United States on board, either for reasons of justice or reasons of, the only thing that moves the United States is self-interest. And so, to the degree, and that's, I think, what's behind what's happening now with Gaza and the normalization, to the degree that this conflict in Gaza is messing up this process of normalization, which is what the United States needs to reassert Western hegemony in the Middle East, as against Chinese and Russian incursions. From that point of view, the United States will put brakes on Israel and say, no, you can't invade Rafah, you can't do whatever. So if the one state can fit into that somehow, you can show that the one state is really going to somehow move ahead American interests, then the United States might play a role. But if it's simply a matter of Israel is, I wrote another book called War Against the People, where Israel has really become the enforcer of rights in the enforcer of global capitalism. Because as neoliberalism begins to shut down and more people are excluded, middle-class people in the global north and not only the global south, it has to become more repressive. And there's a war against the people going on globally. And Israel, with its Palestinian laboratory, is the world's leader. It's not the only one, but it's the world's leader in technologies of repression. You mentioned Pegasus, surveillance, all kinds of weapons for population control, many of which are being tested in Gaza as we speak, especially drones, AI. Israel's developed, artificial intelligence targeting systems that today generate more targets in Gaza than the Israeli Air Force can possibly attack. So Israel takes from the Palestinian laboratory, it's got millions of people it can experiment on. Why is Israel, securing airports all over the world? Because it's the world's leader in biometrics and facial recognition systems and so on. Why? Because you've got 600 checkpoints in the West Bank. And all the Israeli security companies there are testing their products on Palestinians that come through all the time. So that the big problem here in this transactional world is that Israel has made itself so useful to not just the United States, to almost every country. Israel gives arms everywhere. Even to countries like Saudi Arabia that don't have relations with Israel. And so that's going to be the problem so much is how do we somehow compensate for, this role that Israel plays that's so useful to the United States and Europe, but also to China. Israel's the #2 arms supplier to China after Russia. Israel's the #2 arms supplier to India. So, it's interesting. We look at the BRICS countries as this alternative global south to the global north. So you got the World Bank and the IMF and so on of the global north, the WTO, and the G7 countries, and now you got BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, with another 10 new members now, including, interesting enough, Saudi Arabia. The idea is that BRICS are an alternative. But if you look at it from a transactional point of view, Israel is right in bed with all the BRICS countries. BRIC are getting most of their weapons or a lot of their weapons from Israel. And, and the only odd man out in BRICS is the S. South Africa has brought Israel in front of the ICJ. So that's the problem you're facing, is how do you deal with these transactional short-term interests that countries have that determine their policy rather than justice and human rights, international law that we always talk about. So we have to try to come up with a strategy that deals with that, in which we can, and I think the ANC dealt with that by mobilizing the people. It didn't deal with governments. Governments were also thought Mandela was a terrorist. And if we can mobilize with a political plan the millions of people around the world that support Palestinian rights, and they begin to affect their governments, then we're playing the right game politically, I think, and then we have a chance to do this.
What's our method on online questions? You put them in the chat, or do we go to them? We have any hands raised or in the process of being raised among the people? Pardon me?
Yes, all the last comments that you made were very much on point. However, there's one other thing which we have to talk about, and that is the theocratic element, both in Judaism and in Islam, and as it has played out and is playing out for the last 100 years in this struggle. And any move toward a one unitary state is going to be very difficult and complicated by that. I mean, right now, I kind of jokingly say that on the West Bank, God is the real estate agent and has hung out his shingle for Judea and Samaria. And you have similar kind of things obviously being expressed in a different form, of course, on countries that are Islamic. So I think the whole religious aspect of it is going to be very, very difficult to overcome. And just saying, well, if you want to be Orthodox whether in Islam or in Judaism, you can be that way under this unitary state. Yes. But I think it's going to be a very difficult process to overcome.
Can you please let me make a comment again behind what he just said?
A question would be more appropriate at this point.
Well, it just follows up on what the fellow was just saying. In fact, what has been said a couple times through the conversation, and that is people are ignoring the fact that the USSR got there and was destroyed, of course, by the US hegemon and his friends. Cuba has been working on getting there. As we say, it takes time. And I'm sure people would like to be reminded, it just doesn't happen overnight. If anybody saw the last emperor about sending the leader of China to the re-education camps, people would be understanding the idea it doesn't happen overnight. They had him there for years. Venezuela keeps working on getting there. Many nations throughout the world are working on getting there and being destroyed. They're being bombed. They're being interfered with in every possible way that that can stop them. I hope that contributes to the conversation. It's being done.
Okay. There's no hands raised online? Any other questions in-house? Yes.
Again, thank you so much for the presentation. I think the idea of a one state is brilliant and necessary. But my question is, how are you going to initiate this? Is this going to be a grassroots sort of situation, or have you already started somehow or other to create this awareness of one state government, and what kind of reception has it gotten so far, if there's any?
Well, that's a very good question. And you know, that's why we call this a struggle. Because it's not easy on any level to progress issues like this. You know, one problem is that you know, this has to be led by Palestinians. In other words, I'm an Israeli. I'm a stakeholder as well in this, and but you know, basically the struggle for liberation, and if there is one state, you know, the fact that the Palestinian rights are national rights are respected, and that there really is a state of equality, means that the Palestinians have to be very assertive. I mean, they have to protect their interests and articulate what they want and so on. And in this level of the struggle, even getting there, like I said, an end game really has to be articulated by Palestinians. I'm part of the group, but I can't speak for the Palestinian people, obviously. And so the big difficulty is not that the one state idea, all Palestinians accept. I think 99.9%, because that's always been their idea. Palestine was one country before 1948. You know, and the opposition to Zionism before 48 was always in terms of one country and anti-colonialism, getting the British out, trying to control the Zionists, and having a Palestine emerge, which didn't happen. And then the PLO, this is the PLO's project, and so on. So that's not the problem. The problem is, once you try to define what do we mean, and for this, like, I spent 45 minutes trying to lay out the outlines of one state. Well, you get disagreements. I mean, you do have people that say, no, this shouldn't be a civic state. There should be one Palestinian state. For Palestinians, let me just go back for 1 second to my famous slides here. For Palestinians, if we could see this, the idea of liberation for most Palestinians isn't what I presented. For them, liberation means liberation. Palestine becomes Palestine again, becomes a Palestinian state. And now Jews living in the country can live in the country as equal citizens. I mean, nobody's going to throw anybody out. In other words, their idea is a Palestinian democracy that ironically is kind of the reverse of a Jewish democracy. I think with some of the same problems. But that's their idea. The idea is it's Palestine. It's called Palestine. It's not called Zatar. And it's a Palestinian state. And then within that state, Jews have equal rights as citizens, but they're not a national group. And Palestinians refuse to recognize Israelis as a national group because that, from their point of view, rewards settler colonialism. So, and this is I think the view of the vast majority of Palestinians. So what is the one state? Is it a state of a Palestinian state, like on the left-hand side, total liberation? Is it a binational state, which is also a very popular concept, power sharing within the state? Or is it a shared state, a civil society? Well, that's really important. And then you get into issues, besides that, you get into the issues, of religion. Some Palestinians say it should be a secular, the PLO said this should be a secular state. Well, 80% of Palestinians are not secular. They're religious in one way or another, especially with Muslims and the Christians. So secular doesn't speak to them. So, what is the role of religion in the state? These are really important questions that have to be built into a program. The problem is that it's very hard to get a Palestinian discussion over this because they've been so dispersed on purpose. So you've got 5 different Palestinian peoples. You got those inside Israel that are citizens. You got those in the West Bank that are separated from those in Gaza. You've got Palestinians in the refugee camps, and those in Lebanon are separated from those in Syria, that are separated from those in Jordan. And then you've got the diaspora, and Gaza is Gaza, and so on. I mean, they can't communicate with each other. I mean, they can't physically meet with each other. And of course, then what happens, and there's no more PLO. That's also really crucial. Arafat dismantled the PLO. When Oslo happened and he wanted to be the president of a Palestinian authority or a state or whatever, and so the Palestinians lost that hub that had been, that had connected all these disparate elements all over. Well, if you don't have a liberation organization and you don't have that hub, and you've got a leadership that's collaborationist. I mean, that's the irony. There still is a PLO on paper. You know who the head of it is? Abu Mazen. Abu Mazen is a collaborator with Israel. So you have a collaborator, talk about being smart as a settler colonial regime. You co-opt the other, you had the leader of the native population supposed to be resisting you is on your payroll. And gets all the, his job is to secure the West Bank for Israel. Now they're preparing him to take over Gaza, maybe. So you see, you've got all of that. And then with no PLO now for 30 some years, what's happened is each of those Palestinian communities is now on their own, and they got to survive. So those that are inside Israel become Israeli Arabs, and they have their own agenda and their own, how do we survive? Those in the camps have another agenda of surviving. Those on the West Bank and Gaza, in the diaspora, Palestinians come to the US and they want to be Americans, because they know they're not going back to Palestine. So their agenda is to become So in other words, you've got all these communities not in touch with each other that all have centripetal lives trying to survive wherever they are. So that's really the problem. It isn't the content of the program so much. The one state idea is accepted. It's getting a critical mass of Palestinians behind a political program that's coherent, that you can present to political leaders as a real political program. And that's really the problem that we're facing. And there's some movement to try to revive the PLO, although Abu Mazen is opposing that. Our group, which is a small group but growing, is a grassroots kind of a group. But, it's very hard for us to reach out to refugee camps, for example. In Lebanon, it's forbidden by law to have any contact with anyone inside Israel, including Palestinians. In other words, Palestinians inside Israel, or put it this way, Palestinians in Lebanon, in the camps, are forbidden to even do Facebook or Twitter or call Palestinians inside Israel. So you see, they have those Gaza's completely disconnected from the outside world. So those are the real difficult issues that we're facing. And I think it's those organizational issues that we have to try to work on, rather than, because without that, we can't really get to formulating a program. So it's a process. It's urgent on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's just a really difficult situation to, and let me just say one more sentence, and that is, of course, the issue of leadership. Because any Palestinian leader that emerges from the age of 13 up is identified and either killed or imprisoned, either by Israel or the Palestinian Authority. Israel has 10,000 Palestinians in prison today, besides the Hamas fighters that it has. There's another 10,000 of them. So that's also really an issue. You don't have the leadership because the leadership has been eliminated before it can even begin to be a leader. Look at Marwan Barghouti, who's been 20 some years in prison. So there's really very serious obstacles to this that we have to work through. Just to end on a light note. Did our moderator go home or go to a meeting? Bob?
Here's
See, we're leaderless again.
my question is, what's the role of the surrounding Arab countries? And more specifically, are there any allies for the Palestinians in that region, and in what way, and without starting a nuclear conflict?
Well, of course, the Arab peoples are very strong allies to the Palestinians. I mean, even Saudi Arabia, is conditioning normalization on some promise of a Palestinian state. Even Saudi Arabia has public opinion in the street that it has to think about. In other words, there is very active and deep support for Palestinians in the street that governments have to be careful of. Partly because, demands, the support of Palestinians for their liberation can easily spill into an Arab Spring in any of the Arab countries. So there's a divide or a disconnect between the people who support Palestinians and the governments, all of whom are afraid of the Palestinians. And afraid, Palestinians are very proud of the fact that they've had elections. Besides Abu Mazen turning autocratic, they have a strong democratic tradition, and and that's threatening to the Arab regimes. I mean, all the Arab regimes are autocratic. And so that's also a dance. I think to the degree that the people, can make their support of Palestinians manifest, I think governments will be less opposed to Palestinian rights. But on the other hand, what you have today, what you can see with this normalization process, is that Arab states, it's a transactional world again. Arab states have their interests. They have Israel can deliver much more than Palestinians. So if you're Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or, and you're afraid of Iran, or if you're Egypt, and you're afraid of your own population, another Arab Spring, Israel delivers the goods. Israel can control Iran. Israel can give you the technologies to repress your own populations if you want. And Israel is also a mediator. So, for example, one of the costs of normalization is that Saudi Arabia wants nuclear weapons from the United States. So you talk about, religion and so on. Here's the United States arming a Wahhabi extreme Islamic. This is what Al Qaeda came from, was Saudi Arabia. That's the ideology of the government there. Being nuclear armed by Israel, by the United States, because if they participate in normalizing with Israel, then the United States is talking about setting up a Middle Eastern NATO. Because the United States wants to withdraw from the Middle East. It wants to pivot to China. So it needs a kind of a surrogate. So it's looking at Israel in particular, and Egypt and Saudi Arabia as the three pillars of Western and American interests in the Middle East. Well, if you put that, against supporting Palestinian rights, it's obvious that those bigger interests have much more sway in the Arab governments. So again, the problem becomes, it's all our problems. How do the people make their will and their desires manifest in government policy? How do we affect government policy? Because our governments are operating on a completely different level with completely different interests and dynamics and so on. So the answer is yes, Palestinians have tremendous support in the Arab countries, but not from the Arab governments, because Israel has much more to offer them than the Palestinians do.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. If there's no more questions, I think we just thank Jeff for speaking.
All right, thank you for having me. It
Thank
was
you.
good to meet you all. I will do it again. Next time I have to come and tell you how we implemented the one-state solution.
Okay.
Good night.